Good morning.
Morning.
Very happy to be here this morning. I'm especially happy because today is actually almost exactly the third anniversary of a day when I almost didn't make it here because I got lost on the way. So I was a little apprehensive about this. In fact, I wrote it down. It was June 14th, 2015. Now, my topic that day was, you can't get there from here. And I think that I had thought about those words so much in the weeks before I came here, I thought I almost demonstrated it, almost manifested it. But my topic today is the very innocuous, are you a victim of rust? And so I thought, well, what could possibly go wrong with that title? And then I heard about the golf tournament being played in the area. And so immediately my inner warrior went to work. And if it went to work overtime, worried about this, worried about that, well, is it going to still be bad on the weekend? How early should I leave? Am I even going to make it? And all of that. So finally I put all that aside, because as we'll see, I'll touch on it later, but worry is one of the useless things we can possibly do. I put that aside, and the result was I left my house a half hour earlier than I usually did, and got up here almost an hour earlier than I usually did. So it worked out fine. Well, the topic here this month is transformation. And as I was thinking about what to speak on this morning, I realized that since we're dealing with New Thought principles, anything and everything I could possibly talk about would deal with transformation. In a booklet called Journey into Life, Dr. Ernest Holmes, who developed the science of mind, spiritual philosophy, wrote, "The birth of a new state of consciousness is an inner transformation. It is a state of consciousness which no longer depends upon the condition as it appears to be, but which reaches through the seen to the unseen, which plunges beneath the surface and arrives at the spiritual cause of things." And so we're always talking about two types of transformation whenever we talk about something in New Thought. First is the transformation of consciousness. And this is the changing of consciousness, of thought and feeling, usually first consciously, which when accepted subconsciously produces the second type of transformation, and this is the transformation of our physical experience. People, places, things, situations, events, which comes about as the result of the subconscious change, the subconscious transformation. But this morning I want to talk about a particular type of transformation. So I'll ask the question, are you a victim of rust? And I'm not talking about the kind of rust that starts to form on a Brillo pad after a day or two, making it totally useless for any more cleaning. And believe me, that drives me insane. It drives me insane, and there's no solution for it. I've asked people, I've looked it up online, nobody knows what to do about it. One answer I read, they said, well, cut the Brillo pad in half. And I'm thinking, well, what good does it do to cut the Brillo pad in half? The thing is small enough to begin with, and now you have two little pieces that clean half as much and will rust just as quickly. But I'm not talking about that kind of rust. And I'm not talking about the rust that forms on fences and other metalwork, corroding them and making them ugly. And I'm not talking about the rust that accumulates in old pipes, clogging them up and eventually wearing them away. The rust that I'm talking about this morning is spiritual rust. Spiritual rust. But we'll see that this spiritual rust acts in much the same way as the material rust. Now, back in 1941, in the Nautilus magazine of New Thought, A woman by the name of Marie Hapgood Tung told this story. She said, "The old galvanized iron pipes in my cellar have just been replaced with brass, and the little trickle of water has been changed to a powerful, steady stream. As a reminder, I am keeping a piece of the old pipe. It is so choked with rust that there is barely room for the point of a lead pencil to penetrate. But what has a rusted piece of pipe to do with me? Just this. I have been interested in truth for years, but had only made my first real demonstration, and I was jubilant. I thought, now I know what to do. I have worked hard to accomplish this. I have affirmed and visualized and read truth night and morning, and now I can rest." Well, that was all true, but I made a big mistake when I felt that at last I could rest from the mental practices which had brought me success. My work didn't go as well. I found it harder to keep enthusiastic about it, and rejections multiplied. She was a writer. Still, I kept on plugging away and wondering why I seemed to be slipping. Fears and doubts that I thought had been laid to rest permanently returned to trouble me. Then came the necessity for the plumber. And when I saw that old piece of pipe, I knew where my own trouble lay. My life channel was choking up with rust. The stream of abundant life was there waiting, but it had no chance to flow through. So while she was taking a rest from her spiritual work, the rust was building up, blocking the channels through which life was seeking to express itself. So what kind of spiritual rust do you have? Maybe you have none at all, in which case I congratulate you. But I would think that most of us have at least some spiritual rust in our consciousness that needs attention. And this can take many forms. We might have the rust of laziness. See, because spiritual work takes effort. It involves making the time to do it. And we're all very busy people with many things to do. So it's easy to say, well, I'll just put it off for a little while. Or I have so much to do that I'll skip it just for today. But a little while becomes a long while, and just for today becomes just for tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. And so the rust builds. See, we have to constantly practice everything we've learned and everything we know. Now, we may have a nice coating of the rust of resentment, and resentment over past hurts and disappointments, or even recent ones, or just resentment in general. Now, resentment is dangerous, and if you think about it, it's quite pointless. Now, it's been said that resentment is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Well, they're not going to die. In fact, they probably don't even know that you resent them. While you go right along boiling over with resentment, becoming, as it were, a bubbling cauldron of malice. You know, a long time ago, many years ago, a good friend of mine called me a bubbling cauldron of malice. He said, you know, you're a bubbling cauldron of malice. And the thing was, he was right. I was a bubbling cauldron of malice. But that was then, that was a long time ago. And I'm not a bubbling cauldron of malice anymore, most of the time. Maybe a little bit, but you know, there's less bubbling and there's less malice. But you don't want to become that. Now, we may have some of the rust of worry. I talked about that in my introduction. We worry about this, and we worry about that, and we worry about the other thing. And the thing is, it's all such a waste. Because, first of all, most of the things that we worry about never come to pass. Think about many of the things you're worried about. They never come to pass. They begin and end totally in our imagination. And they'll only become real if we worry about them enough, if we give them enough attention, if we nurture them and lovingly care for them until we finally subconsciously accept and then embody them. Then something will happen. But most of the time it begins and ends in our imagination. We let it go and nothing happens. And so worry is one of the most useless and destructive activities that we can engage in. Now, we may also have a bit of the rust of despair and discouragement. Now, believe it or not, even students of New Thought occasionally make mistakes or fail to achieve some goal. I know I shocked you telling you that, but it sometimes happens. Now, when this happens, it's easy to become discouraged, and the discouragement can turn into despair as our minds magnify the supposed failure and turn it into something much greater than it ever needed to be. But see, what appear to be failures and mistakes are simply learning experiences moving us along the way to success in whatever it is that we're attempting. And so the only real failure is to allow the rust of despair and discouragement to prevent us from even trying. Now, our own personal spiritual rust is whatever negatives are blocking good from expressing in our lives, and the forms of this are as varied as we are individuals. Now, if we don't want spiritual rust, then we need some kind of spiritual Rust-Oleum. Now, the history of the Rust-Oleum that you buy in the store is actually itself kind of interesting. I would have thought, and I always did think, that it was discovered by a bunch of scientists in a laboratory someplace experimenting with chemicals. But actually it wasn't. The Rust-Oleum company tells us there's a high seas adventure story behind the creation of Rust-Oleum coatings. Captain Robert Ferguson didn't intend to start Rust-Oleum Corporation nearly a century ago. One day he lunged for a container of raw fish oil before it spilled on his rusted metal deck, and he missed. But the Scottish-born sea captain noticed that his spill stopped the spread of corrosion. This observation led him to create the world's first rust-preventative paint. But it wasn't easy. The captain landed and settled in New Orleans to spend years conducting painstaking and smelly research. He finally settled on a fish oil-based paint that stopped rust, dried overnight, and left no lingering aroma, and Rust-Oleum Corporation was born. Well, actually, that's a pretty exciting story. And the high seas, the whole thing, the storm and everything else. But it illustrates that the creative process can take place in unusual and unexpected ways. And it also reminds us to be open and receptive to creative inspiration, coming through all channels, and not try to guess what they're going to be. Now, our spiritual Rust-Oleum is our study, our spiritual work, and the attention we pay to our thought as we go through each day. It's our faith, which is our knowledge and confidence that there's a power that responds to our thought and creates something for us out of it. Now, that story I told before had a happy ending. Actually, they all had a happy ending. My getting here, the story of the Rust-Oleum. But the first story I told had a happy ending because as soon as that woman resumed her spiritual work, things started to turn around. the rust started to dissolve. Her enthusiasm for her writing returned. The ideas started to flow, and her articles were accepted, and she received contracts for more. Now, we can have a happy ending, too. We're always choosing the ending for each particular tale in our life stories. Now, when we understand that our thought is creative and that we have complete control of our thought, we'll recognize that we're absolutely free to create the lives that we want. Well, we can then clear away the spiritual rust, unclog the channels, and allow life to express through us in a more exciting and a more wonderful way. And so ends the lesson.